Okay, everybody ready for the thing to start?
Yes.
How's everybody's asses feeling sitting on that hard floor?
Great.
Nice and comfy?
Oh yeah, sure.
All right. Okay, so I'm John Chandler. I'm with SDA NOLA in New Orleans, and I'm also fairly closely associated with this event. I was here when they first did it about 12 years ago, and I'm a history aggregator. I'm an amateur researcher. My focus is on the context of the historical fencing, the manuals, the masters, the people that were doing the fighting, the people who were getting in legal trouble, people that were getting into wars, etc., that were using these lovely things, swords, among other weapons. And I've been looking into this context thing for a long time and gone pretty deep down various rabbit holes about this, way out beyond the fencing part. This lecture is going to be more specifically about fencing. This is focusing on where Blossfechten is useful, where Harnischfechten needs to take over, and what kind of environment fencers, which includes a fairly wide variety of people, were encountering in the civilian world and on the battlefield, and especially for this lecture, everything in between, where they might have to fight with swords, and what kind of techniques are they going to be able to rely on. So, next slide. So when I first got involved in HEMA back in around 2000, we basically had four contexts for what was in these fencing manuals. We had judicial combat, because a lot of them were specifically, you look at Talhofer, et cetera, there's whole sections that are specifically about fighting in judicial combat. We have formal duels, where you have a second and you announce it, and you have an entire formal process. You have sport, like the Schulfechten that we all know about, and then war. Subsequently to that, we've expanded that a little bit. Back in 2013, I did a lecture at the Higgins Armory based on a book by Anne Tlusty called The Martial Ethic in Early Modern Germany. Anybody here read that? Yeah. Familiar with it, right? So that kind of opened up the context of the informal duel, which we know happened a lot in the towns, where somebody, instead of setting everything up, they just get in an argument in a pub or something, and they go outside and they get in a sword fight. And we know that there's a bunch of special rules. We also know there are rules that are unwritten that are about fighting in pubs in our world. You know, when I was a kid, I was a punk rocker, we used to get in brawls. There's certain things you did, certain things you didn't do. You could hit somebody with a bottle, but if you broke the bottle and stuck it in them, you're gonna get a lot more trouble. Sort of an analogy in the medieval period. We have sport and war, of course. Sport I also expanded into, because there's all these warlike games and martial sports, which are the #1 way that they actually trained for war in medieval Europe, and also beyond Europe, in Central Asia and the Middle East. You know, the Mongols used to shoot the popinjay to practice becoming very good archers. They made a game out of it, and even though they were deadly serious warriors. For this lecture, we're going to be talking about a sixth context. In addition to war, we're going to look at war a little bit. We're going to look at training, the warlike sports. So 4, 5, and 6. But the sixth context is paramilitary. This is where it's not just an informal duel, but maybe it's like, historical fencing club in Baton Rouge and a historical fencing club in Austin decide they don't like each other. And they get together, they run into each other, and you got 6, 7 people on either side. Or maybe you're just trying to travel from Baton Rouge to Austin, and you run into some people that just want to shake you down and take your stuff. That's our paramilitary context. So we're going to get into that a little bit. Next slide. So one thing I just mentioned was shooting the popinjay. This is an image, one of many that'll be in this lecture, that are from our period. I'm kind of focusing on the end of the 15th century and the beginning of the 16th, because this is kind of the peak armor period. This is from the Balthasar Behem Codex, which is a book of guild regulations from Krakow in 1505. And you see here a bunch of burghers shooting a target, which this picture's not coming very clear on this, but that's a little wooden parrot called a popinjay, and they're shooting for big money. These guys are also burghers. They're the militia. You'll notice they've got these half pavises. They're wearing probably full armor, and they look kind of bored. I'm going to read to you some context. This is from Jan Długosz, annalist. Jan Długosz is a bishop that wrote a very wonderful history. He's kind of the medieval Herodotus. So he talked about an incident where his house almost burned down in 1455. He says, 2 disasters now strike the city of Krakow. On the day of the new bishop, Thomas Straczynski is elected. A fine bell with a very pleasant ring, a gift for the late cardinal, is dislodged and falls and breaks the upper part of one ear. thus making it useless until it can be recast. Then the following day, fire breaks out in the house of Thomas the armorer, which is close to the church. The attempts to put it out are half-hearted, because all the apprentices are outside the city shooting the popinjay or watching others do it. Then the wind goes around to the north, the flames break out again. And then he goes on to mention that they think the fire spread because everybody was storing gunpowder in their house, which is another clue about life in Krakow in 1455. He says, some of the houses have gunpowder stored in them. This only increases the blaze. People are concerned to rescue the contents of their houses and not worrying about putting the fire, which in the end consumes 100 houses and 4 churches, as well as the College of Students of Canon Law and the canon Jan Dlugosz, which is the author. And then he goes on to make an anti-Semitic accusation about some armorer who was Jewish. That was probably his fault because he's a Catholic cleric. He has to be anti-Semitic. Okay, so that's context from a text source, which is basically talking about this. They're shooting the popinjay so they can't put the fire out. Next slide. So this, unfortunately, you can't see too much detail, but this is one that Nathan wanted me to include, and it's really important. This is a painting that has to do with being melancholy while everybody else is having fun. But what it really is, this is a Schützenfest. And what's going on in here, this is a giant sort of combination MMA / horse race / town fair that the cities would put on, mainly to encourage people to train to shoot. But they also do fencing. These two guys here are doing probably Kunstfechten. There's some grappling here. There's shooting. Go to the next slide, we'll see some more detail. Shooting with, let's see, firearms, crossbows, bows, fencing. There's a fully armored joust or melee going on down here on horseback, bows, etc. So these Schützenfest were probably the most important training events. Everybody went to them, the nobles, the peasants, the other burghers. There would be sometimes fights between the estates. Go back one slide. Can you go back? You can't really see this, but everybody's bathing naked over here and drunk. These are fairly rowdy affairs. And down here, they're bowling. There's a bunch of acrobats, some of which have swords. If you read the fencing manuals, they're always complaining about all the fake fencing masters. So that's them down here having fun. There's people dancing also with swords, which is something that the peasants did a lot. So that's probably peasants. By the way, if you ever heard the term boorish, like you're being boorish, that comes from the German Bauer. It means peasant. This is the townfolk ridiculing the peasants, which they did a lot. Next slide. Okay, so we know that the nobles used to come to the towns to learn some of these skills. They would come to these events for their jousting and all that, but they also tried to learn fencing, shooting, and all these other things, as did the sort of in-between classes that made up a lot of the military at this time. This is a lovely little passage that Christian Trosclair just translated pretty recently, and he gave me permission to read this to you. So this is by a guy named Hans Wilhelm Kirchhoff, who was a Landsnet captain and very active author who wrote a whole bunch of books. So he's describing going to learn some fencing in the town of Ulm. He says, okay, about a fencing master and their student. All this gives me cause to think about another anecdote, which is in the year 1547, I studied the free knightly art of fencing in all weapons, but not in rapier, which wasn't in fashion at the time, from one master, Wolf Torrance of Ulm, a good, capable man who was a good scrivener of German and a professional of arithmetic. And he once taught me a particularly good little play to use against somebody, which he deigned to let me see. Now I gotta ask, who's an instructor here? Anybody ever taught a student something and then they got you with it right after? So he deigned to let me see it. So it was sort of a secret and he let him see it. As I set myself to this, I subsequently did a small series of passes. The first pass remained without a strike, but on the second, while I warded left and right, I changed off from the right hand and fought from the left, and cranked my right thigh over my left and let it uncoil all according to his instructions. And it came together as I thought myself bound, but the master threw away his sword from himself and had his handkerchief against his right ear and turned himself away from me. I immediately became aware that his collar and neck were red and bloody. I froze in terror and said that it was not out of malice. I had done nothing with the intent to hit him in such a manner. But he kept turning himself away from me and said that, be that as it may, he would instruct me another time, for he's the master and he parted from me and never spoke another word to me the rest of his life. He thought to get even with me by fashioning a satirical cartoon wherein he plunged me in a yellow cloth and thought that I would let it go and die off. He was placated by the master painter, Michelin Müllerin, who was an upstarting pious man, who was himself famous and particularly good, a halberd fencer, who knew well the habits of fencers, counseling against so as not to cause greater acrimony from it. So apparently this guy was training with a shark, and that's itself is interesting. It's also interesting that this guy who is a landsnet captain is going to the town. He's basically, a couple of artisans are teaching him the knightly art of fencing, including with a halberd. And it's also funny, this guy that does a propaganda print against this, which is very common back then. You know, medieval society is very litigious, very literate, and loves doing propaganda. It's like a meme, right? This guy's a jerk. But the guy himself, the master, came to a sticky end. He says after that, the master wolf came to a shameful end of life. At that time, he gave himself the title of captain. Actually, I think that would be skipper, receiving money to take on sailors with a ship. He was overtaken by drink in a town by the river Weser. He hired a ship, laid himself therein, and slept. But the ship's crew, buying into the idea that he was rich based on his gold rings, slew him as he slept and threw him in the water. So, don't be a dick if your student gets you with a technique. It just means you're a good teacher. Next slide. Okay, so that we were just covering the martial sports and the warlike games. Now we're going to get into warfare a little bit. So this is from the von Wolfegg House book. Anybody here familiar with this book? You should be. You should go look at it. It's fascinating. So this book comes from around 1480, probably from Strasbourg or maybe one of the other Alsatia towns like Colmar. And it shows every aspect of life at this time. And one of the aspects of life was war. So this is actually probably urban militia deploying for war. And what you see here, these are war wagons. There's a couple other pictures where you can see each of these has a cannon in it. These are supply wagons. These are little groups of infantry. These are cavalry scouts. And this is the main body of the cavalry back here. Next slide, you'll see it a little clearer here. So these are the infantry. And what I want you to look at is how much protective gear do they have? Because we're going to be thinking about Blossfechten versus Harnischfechten. So this group right here, both of these are skirmishers. These are handguns, these tubes they've got. A couple of them have crossbows. You notice the armor that they have or don't have. This guy's got a helmet, this guy's got a helmet, breastplate. None of them have any armor on their legs here. A couple of them don't even have helmets. Most of them do have helmets. Most of them have some kind of torso protection. These guys with the halberds and all the other various polearms, which is probably interesting if you're interested in polearms. There's a variety of them. They have a little more armor. You see, here's one guy with some palanes. You know, he's got almost a half armor. He's pretty well protected. This guy's pretty much just got torso and helmet and a little bit on his shoulders. So you see partially protected. You see this guy got a little armor on the front, nothing on the back. So you can kind of think about how do you kill one of these people if you're in a fight with them, or how do you disable them? Next slide. This is the cavalry. So for this particular sortie, none of these cavalrymen, which are probably demi-lancers and mounted crossbowmen, you see a guy here with a crossbow, none of them have any leg armor. Quite a few of them don't have anything on their arms. You see their bare hands, a lot of them. This guy is from, that's Rick Moranis from, what was that Star Wars parody? Spaceball. Some of them have really big helmets. But you can still cut him on his arm, I think, and definitely on his leg. Okay, next slide. This is a famous battle that happened in 1499. This is one of the battles when Emperor Maximilian was starting to flex muscles. He had developed the Landsknecht phenomena, and one of his generals, Captain George von Frundsberg, who was very effective at using the Landsknecht, decided we're going to try and take on the Swiss, which was always kind of risky, especially if it's on their home turf, which this was, right on the edge of their territory. Next slide. I want to draw your attention. The Swiss won the battle, but it was close. The Swiss really never lost against the Germans, almost. This is the main heavy infantry column for the Swiss. That's the flag of Zurich. That's the flag of Bern, which is a bear. By the way, if you go to Bern, there's a lot of bears with guns all over the place on their fountains, some of them dating back to the 15th, 16th century. That's Solothurn. These flags over here have little guns on them. Those are for what are called forlorn hopes. Those are the guys that go out with the guns, and a lot of times will be protected by a couple of Montante dudes. and you see some guns here. You see the firearms. All the knights are right in front of them. Now, those knights on horseback are wearing cap-à-pied harness. They are wearing full harness. Even then, it might have the back of the legs exposed and so forth. But those guys, however, this infantry, like most infantry, no armor on the legs. Because I don't know, last time you walked 20 miles, hard to do with stuff on your legs. Most of them, they have these red caps. Most of those guys are wearing iron cap under their caps. Even the heavy cavalry do not have their faces covered, because you need to see and breathe on the battlefield. The visor goes down when you're doing the lance charge, when you're right at the point of impact, or when somebody's shooting a shower of arrows at you or something like that. Next slide. So here we can see there's a bunch of little great side battles on that picture, the Battle of Dornach. But here's a guy, he almost looks like he's kitted out like a Viking. He's got a mail shirt, he's got like a conical helmet on, he's got a basilard, that's his water bottle, I think, and he's got a nice longsword. And he's finishing off somebody else in the other army. He's not fully protected. His face is exposed, his legs are exposed, but he's fairly well protected. The mail will stop pretty much any kind of cut from almost anything, but an armor-piercing weapon will get through it. Just think about how you would fight that guy. Next slide. Again, this is another one of these little, the denouement. This was the German, or Holy Roman Emperor's artillery, which has been overrun. You can see some of the big guns over here, the bombards. These Swiss guys pulling down an imperial flag there. This guy's about to get cut with an axe or a halberd. That's probably maybe the cannon master. We see another longsword being used here. This guy's in full armor, but he's just stabbing him in the face because his face isn't protected. One more. Okay, another battle a little bit later. This is 5 years later. It's pretty much the same German army, and we got a bunch of stars. So we got George von Frundsberg. We got Emperor Maximilian himself here. We have Guts von Berlichingen. Everybody knows who that is? The guy with the mechanical iron arm. Come on.
Yeah.
This is the battle where he got his arm blown off, and there's a couple competing stories about how it happened. But this was a really important and famous battle, and there's a lot of art about it, because these guys over here are the Czechs. And for pretty much the entire 15th century, from 1420 up until this battle, the Czechs pretty much always beat everybody. They just had everybody's number. And this is the first time they were defeated, and it's because George von Frundsberg lined up some cannons here, blew a hole in their Pavese wall, and then the cavalry was able to get in there and get them, although they were allowed to march off the battlefield in good order and so forth. Emperor Maximilian almost died, and his life was saved. And Ludwig von Ibe, who's one of our fencing master manual creators, was at this battle, and if you look at his Kriegsbook, he has a lot of really interesting war machines, but also all the weird patterns of the Czech Hussite war wagons that they use for a lot of their victories. Next slide. So there's, like I said, there's a bunch of depictions of this battle. This is another depiction of the same battle. And once again, we can see, here's the Czech, we would probably call that medium infantry here, behind their big Paveses. The Paveses were specially made. There's a guy called Andres Bichler in Munich who dissected one of these things, and it had ground glass and iron filings in it. Somehow or another, these things were bulletproof. And the muskets and so on they were using at the time were quite powerful. You get to 3,000 joules at the muzzle. These are gigantic. I'm talking 16th century. You've seen a Spanish musket where it's always on a stand. You can't hold it and shoot it. You have to put it on a stand. It's basically a cannon. But these things were very effective. Crossbow, halberd. Here's a guy with a longsword finishing somebody off. Lots of people fighting. This is probably Emperor Maximilian, whose horse went down and somebody had to rescue him. But once again, if you look closely, you'll see armor on the body, armor on the head. But for a lot of people, unless it's one of these guys in the full cap-à-pied harness on the horseback, all the infantry are wearing armor on their body and their head, and sometimes some other pieces, but not full armor. And this is at the time of peak armor in the Middle Ages. Next slide. Just a little bit about the Hussites, and we can see a little bit more detail here. The Hussites were organized according to Fahnlein and Roth, which was file and column. They used these war wagons. That system was copied by the Swiss and the Germans for managing their infantry, for the Landsknecht and so forth. They had relatively light gear. These guys would be wearing like a padded coat, some kind of metal armor on their body, probably something on their head, but open face, no leg protection, usually no arm protection either. They had very good firearms and crossbows. They used these big two-handed flails, which could were armor-defeating weapons, and these special pikes. All right, next slide. All right, here's another crazy battle. This is, again, a little bit later. Battle of Orsha. In this battle, the Poles, who are depicted here in armor on armored horses, which you really don't see that often in artwork in this period, were fighting the Muscovites. So this is like what's going on in the news today. So the Muscovites were invading. This happened in what is now Ukraine, and huge battle, lots of different infantry. We got some guys in Kappa K armor right here. Everybody else on here has got less armor. Next slide. So here you can see some interesting depictions. Here's a bunch of the Poles going across the river. Some of them that have probably been wounded or taken their armor off, so in case they need to leave or something. Here's the Polish heavy cavalry, which are armored like typical knights. Here's the heavy infantry, which you can just barely see behind there. Pavizes, they are not fully armored because they got to walk, right? Some of the knights are dismounted and are fighting in the front of the heavy infantry. Next slide. This is the heavy infantry again, just so you can see a little close up. There's all these cannons there amongst them. What happened in the battle, the Poles did a false retreat. They pretended they were running away, that the Muscovites chased them and got hit by a fusillade of cannons, and then were counterattacked. Next slide. So these guys with the top hats, this is a thing that started around this time, maybe a little earlier, maybe 40, 50 years earlier, but this is light infantry. These are Hungarian-style hussars. They may have actually been Lithuanian guys, but these top hats are a type of light armor. It's a leather hat, and that's where the top hat comes from. People imitating these guys. The tie that you wear if you work at a corporate job actually comes from a cravat that was worn typically by Croatian light cavalry. But these guys have these funny little curving shields that look like a teardrop, and they'll put it in front of them when they're charging, and then when they're retreating, it goes on their back. And they are routing the Muscovite heavy cavalry or medium cavalry, the Drushina, who are wearing type of armor that they call Yushman or Bakhterets. If you guys ever seen the Battle of the Nations, or you're familiar with any kind of Russian kit, this is a kind of cool armor made up of little pieces of metal connected together with some mail. But again, they're not wearing armor over their whole body. They are basically medium cavalry with a lot of capabilities, and they're quite tough. But because they've been just blasted with cannon fire, they're running, so the light cavalry gets them. This kind of light cavalry became more and more important on the battlefield. It was already important at this time, 1514. Next slide. So here you see some Druzina doing what's called the Parthian shot. This is something that the Muscovites learned from the Mongols, which goes back to ancient Greece time in the steppe. These are the Czech Hussites who actually helped really turn the battle. They were mercenaries. These are their war wagons, but they did not pay the artists to paint the painting, so they're just up in the corner. Next slide. Okay, so we're looking at this is the conclusions we can draw from these, looking at these battle pictures from war. Some fighters have Kappa K armor. Fighting those guys, you got to use harness fecting for sure, but most don't. The torso and the head are the most protected. Actually, to my surprise, I looked at a ton of these paintings. The torso is actually the most protected. It's unlike today, where the last armor we had was the helmet that went away for a while and then came back in World War I, or the Franco-Prussian War. The faces are almost always exposed unless you're literally at the point of contact in a lance charge or you're under a shower of arrows. Average coverage, I would call it 30-40% of your body is covered by armor in these battle paintings. And light and medium infantry and cavalry are real important on these battlefields. A lot of the protection is provided by shields and war wagons and mantlets and all kinds of stuff like that. Mobility is really important, even for infantry. This was the big thing the Swiss were good at. Yeah?
I don't know if the detail allows you to have an answer, but for the torso, would it mostly just be a breastplate, or would it be fully clothed?
That's a good question. There's a range. So if you are a citizen, a bottom level citizen, let's say you're a journeyman cutler in a town, you are obligated to get some armor protection. It varies by town, but usually the minimal thing is something the Germans call a Plattendienst, which means like the armor that a gentleman would wear. It's somebody that's like a functionary for a noble. And that is a textile vest with pieces of metal under it, like a cheap Whisby coat. If you got a little more money, you're an established cutler or you're a goldsmith or something, you're probably gonna have a real nice proofed, tempered breastplate, Some of those guys have mail, and sometimes that mail might be centuries old, like some of it goes way back. That was the case like in the British Isles, the Gallaglass guys. So it's a range. There's another painting I have in one of my books where you can see the Amsterdam militia in their armor, like posing, and they all look kind of sour because they just turned Calvinists, so they're all scowling. They all have horrible bowl haircuts, you know. But they all have fairly formidable looking armor because they're probably a fairly rich guild that got commissioned the painting. But it's all different and it looks kind of weird. It's like it's not. We're used to looking at a uniform. All right. Anybody else before we go on? Next slide. Okay, so when we think about the difference between harness-fectin and blood-fectin, what are the advantages of harness-fectin versus blood-fectin? What is the difference? So for harness-fectin, I would say you have a little bit shorter reach if you're choking up, if you're doing half sorting and so forth. You have more control at a bind. So if you get a bind, you can do all kinds of dramatic things. You have leverage. It's a little better for grappling, and your focus is going to be on thrusting and strikes usually with the blunt, with the pommel or something like that. Blood-fectin, I would argue, has longer reach. It's a little quicker. It's maybe a little more flexible. You can cut very easily, you can slice very easily, but you also thrust, and you also do pommel strikes and so forth too. So just start thinking as we're looking at the next few slides, what is the difference really between a harness-fectin technique and a blood-fectin technique, and which one would you use? Next slide. Okay, so now we're getting into the paramilitary. We went through the war, we went through the training. Paramilitary includes things like political uprisings, which happen constantly in the towns, sometimes also, in nobles' courts. Sectarian conflict, like we talked about the Czechs. They were heretics. They wanted to exterminate the Czechs. They tried really hard to exterminate the Czechs. They couldn't do it. The Czechs kind of exterminated a lot of them, and then they eventually had to make a deal. Factional family disputes. You get that a lot in the Mediterranean especially, but it also happens up in Central Europe. You got families that have hated each other for centuries and have been aggravating each other for centuries, and that can flare up. And then feuds and robbery. So the robbery and feud goes together because what happens all the time is that knights get into legal trouble or financial trouble or both, and they declare a feud against some entity. Like I declare a feud against the Duke of Houston. That means I can legally rob every one of you because you're in Houston. But you're from Galicia, and the Duke of Galicia says, I'm not part of that. You rob my guy, I'm sending some people out to go burn your castle, and these things escalate, and therefore there are kind of unwritten rules for robbery too, which we'll get into in a second. Next slide. So yeah, when you're traveling, if you read a travelogue, if you read personal accounts and memoirs, almost every time they travel across any significant amount of countryside in Central Europe, they run into robbers. They don't always get robbed, but I'm just going to read one example to you, which is next. Go to the next one. So this is from a travelogue of some Czech guys that were doing a diplomatic mission all over Europe. They went to every country in Europe, and right off the bat, as they're going through Germany, he says, "Item, we rode from Ansbach to Furtwangen and Kilsang. Here in two places certain men set upon my lord with the intent to overthrow him, but as everyone, lord, nobleman, and page, carried his crossbow on his saddle, they came to the conclusion that we were too strong for them." That was 40 guys. So 40 guys, everybody's got a crossbow and probably looks like they can use it because they're Czechs. They don't get robbed. But these guys were robbed later. They had, one of their guys was kidnapped, probably sold into slavery, actually when they were in Catalonia. Anyway, this is just one of many examples. I'll encourage you guys to, and I'll share some primary sources, you can read them yourself. But when you read personal accounts, it's like whatever it's about, as they're traveling, robbers. It's always robbers. Keep going. But the robbers don't always necessarily kill. They're out to rob you and maybe kidnap. If they kill you or maim you, that could cause a lot of extra problems for them. So next slide. Okay, so the final part of this, we're going to look at the court of the Herzog of Bavaria. Actually, two Herzogs. And this is the way he was depicted, as literally the top dog. He was a dog. The Herzog is roughly the equivalent to an English duke. And one of the things they used to do in the 15th, 16th century was they liked, just like we today have Instagram and so forth, they like to record images of themselves and their people, and to glorify their greatness. So this guy had some painters paint paintings of all the nobles that came to visit him in his castle, in his palace, over a particular period of time. This is the mid-16th century. Next slide. So we're going to go through all these barons and counts and look at what they're wearing and what they've got, and think about, do we want to fight these guys with blood-fectin? Think you're a robber, or maybe you're in a feud and you did something to your family. How do you want to go after this guy? So let's look at the first two. This guy's wearing half armor under his clothes. Very common to wear it under the clothes. This is a good way, to kind of not reveal your, until you're close, you won't know. But he's also got gauntlets. He has undoubtedly an iron cap under that hat. This guy's a little harder to tell. He looks like he's got some armor that's very stiff. I would assume he's got a breastplate. His hands are not protected. His lower legs, none of their lower legs are protected. Longsword, lance, longsword, and a whip for the horse. Next slide. Here's a couple more barons. This guy, he's being pretty cagey. He's got he's got an overcoat on. Nice fashion sense, don't we think? He's got a hood, so he might have a mail coif under there. We don't know, but almost certainly an iron cap under his hat. He's got a warhammer, so he's ready to deal with armor if he has to, and a long sword, probably chest protection. I would say almost certainly. This guy looks like he may have some armor going down his thighs. He's got a long sword, I think, and a dagger there. Nothing on his head though. So he's somebody maybe you could get, or maybe he already took his helmet off. Next slide. Okay, so this guy definitely well equipped. I would use harness fecting against him. He's got a visored helmet. He can drop that visor if he wants to. Lance and a longsword. This guy's got a longsword and a lance as well. Also has half armor. You can see the armor coming out. There's tassets, and he's got gauntlets. Both of these guys are pretty well protected. Next slide. So this guy's got a whip. Half armor, tassets right there. Probably an iron cap under his hat. And maybe gauntlets, possibly. Lower legs are unprotected. This guy, probably a breastplate, probably an iron cap, but nothing else that I can see. And a longsword, but he's got a warhammer in case he's riding by. Now you can see the thong on there. Ideally, he's going to have a problem with somebody, a robber's bothering him. He's going to ride by, conk the guy on the head. He can let go of the hammer for a second. Maybe it puts a hole in that helmet. Next slide. Okay, so this guy's a drinker. How many drinkers do we have here today? Anybody gonna have a beer tonight? This guy likes beer too. He's got a longsword. This is a baton of rule, baton of command. It means he's saying, I don't really need too much stuff because I got 60 guys with me, and they have crossbows, whatever. But he is wearing quite a bit of armor. He's got armor all the way down to his knees, as does this guy with a lance. Both of these guys, definitely this guy because of the visor, I would probably have to go to harness fected. Next slide. Okay, so this guy's a more peaceful soul. He's sort of a druid. He's got a oak branch there, and this guy too. They're both nice guys. Optimistic. I would still say he probably has some kind of armor under, maybe a brigandine over there, iron cap on his head. This guy's got a bird that might come in, falcon might come scratch your eyes out if you bother him. And he's wearing, he has a dagger, probably a long sword. That might be just like an army sword. Pointy, looks real pointy. All right, next slide. Okay, a couple other well-dressed guys. I love this guy's hood, baton of command, probably an iron cap, probably breastplate, but not a whole lot else, I don't think. This guy's, on the other hand, this guy is quite well protected except for his lower legs. Next slide. Okay, this guy's, I think, got mail. That's what that is. That's what it looks like to me, but he's got gauntlets and a visored helmet. However, those legs look like an inviting target to me. This guy's gauntlets, undoubtedly, probably half armor under there, definitely an iron cap under his hat, but his face is exposed. Next slide. Couple more barons here. All right, how are we going to attack this guy? What do we see? Anybody spot anything on him? Face. He does have, those are tassets, so he's got some armor on his thighs. These look like textile hand protection. It's weird. Looks like fencing gauntlets. Warhammer and probably an iron cap. His face is exposed. This guy, it's hard to say, but he's got gauntlets. Definitely that's protected. Top of his head's protected. Lower leg's not. Next slide. So this guy's got a pistol. He's not playing. You're going to get up to him and you're going to like, I want all of your, boom! For sure an iron cap under that. He's got half armor and gauntlets, and shooting the pistol with gauntlets is probably some pretty nice gauntlets. That might be worth robbing him alone. This guy's also pretty well protected, half armor and a visored helmet and a warhammer. Is that a warhammer? Am I looking at that right? Yeah, warhammer and a longsword. Notice how many of these guys have longswords. This is mid-16th century, still using longswords. And a lance. Next slide. All right. What techniques are we going to use to kill this guy? Anybody? You're gonna do harness fecting or block fecting?
The last guy used his pistol on him.
There you go. That's an armor-piercing weapon. The pistol's good for armor.
Yeah, those robes or cloak, whatever you want to call it, it looks kind of bulky enough to hide armor.
It definitely probably has armor on his chest and the top of his head, I would say.
The bulge looks like a breastplate, right?
Right. Yeah, it probably to his abdomen, but I don't think his arms are protected. His hands are not protected. His lower legs. This is hose they're wearing. Lower legs definitely not. For me, harness fecting, blast fecting. Assuming you think there's any advantage to blast fecting. Next slide. Okay, another couple of druids, hippies. Right? It's a longsword and an oak branch, which he's going to be. You're bad. You know, he's just going to. It's probably the time of year, so that these guys, even though they're Christians, the pagan stuff is deep into the culture still, and still is over there. So we got armor on the hands, nothing else visible, undoubtedly head and the top of the head and the body. This guy, I don't really see any armor, but maybe the resolution of the picture. Nice longsword. Next slide. I think these guys are bodyguards for Banks. But even there are no armor on the legs. This guy's pretty well kitted out though. Next slide. Back to a couple more barons. Quite well equipped. Both of them, visor helmets. Next slide. Okay, we got another pistol, but he's wearing a male shirt. It's kind of interesting. You might be able to get through a male shirt with a really hard thrust. But anybody know any blast-fected techniques that target the face? Sure. Anybody? That's an easy one. That's like a softball right over the. Okay, so pretty well protected. Next slide. We got another baton of power or of office, maybe a little bit of a wand there. Pistol, mail again. Remember, this is mid-16th century. This guy's got mail and body armor. For sure, he's got an iron cap, where that is an iron cap with like something on top of it, and he looks kind of surly. So be ready for him. But you know, he who looks above is shame below. Get him right on his knee. Next one. Okay, so that's pretty much the end of it. I'm going to say that if you find a time machine and you go back to Prague in 1500 and you decide to travel down to Bavaria, bring a halberd, and if the guy comes at you and bothers you with his sword, cut his leg off because the leg's not protected, and then carry the leg with you so that the next bandit realizes that it's stupid to mess with you. You might also have a pistol that you took from somebody else, and the girls will be impressed, unless you're the girl doing the killing too. So, next slide. Okay, so what kind of weapons did we see? Anybody? A lot of longswords, right? Yeah, a couple of those guys did have like kind of a spada ropera swords, you know, and various messers and other things, but
Oak stick tournament.
Oak sticks, yeah, oak sticks have a significance we have not plumbed yet, and it might be the key to the whole thing. How many of those guys had armor-piercing weapons?
Almost all of them.
Well, not almost. I mean, a lot of them, but I think maybe half. Yeah.
Half.
Yeah. There's a bunch of guys with warhammers, a couple guys with pistols. A lot of them just had long swords, though. But of course, don't forget they got guys with them. Those are barons or counts.
Yeah, some of them have lances, which if you're using them for horseback, can defeat some armor.
Potentially, yeah. I think if you got mail, if all you got is mail, a full lance charge might go through that. But it works against a cut, and most of your thrusts probably. So we had a lot of long swords. How many were in cap-a-pied harness out of those barons?
25%.
None of them had armor on their lower legs. We had a couple that would approach what we might call three-quarters harness. They had armor all the way down, tassets all the way down to the knees. What would you say the typical armor coverage was?
Waist up.
Huh?
Waist up.
Yeah, so what percentage of the target areas? That's what I would say too. So how many of those people could you fight with blast-fecting techniques? A lot. So is it if you got a guy with a breastplate on and a cap on the top of his head, do you choke up and get into your harness fecting and start trying to do the short range leverage stuff? Or do you cut his hand, cut his arm? How many blast-fected techniques target the face? How many target the neck? How many target the forearm? We know with longsword we don't target the lower legs too much, but all the other weapons do. The halberd definitely does, right? So think about that. So the basic premise I'm trying to demonstrate here is that in the battlefield and in this paramilitary context of traveling, and also this also applies to all the situations that happen inside of the towns and in the court and in some abbey or in church, or you never know where it's going to break out. Blasphectin is not limited to I'm only around a bunch of people who aren't wearing armor. You can't count on that anyway. I mean, especially if you're in Italy or Spain, even in the cities, guys who wear mail sometimes under their clothes because they never know there's a vendetta coming. So my argument is that blasphectin actually, it's a continuum. It's not blas or harness. It's sort of a, yeah, exactly. It's a gray area like everything in the early modern period, and we like to reduce things to binaries in the modern time so we can make sense of it. But if you want to understand this period and get your head into it, which is fun, by the way, I recommend it, then get used to gray areas and lots of mixing and blah, blah. Next slide. So those are the main sources that I used. All of those costumes are in a particular book called a Hofkleiderbuch. And there's 2 of those, and they're online. They're pretty cool. There's more. There's like a whole other section of them. This is the travelogue, which is completely insane, of these Czechs that went all through Europe. They encountered people fencing on ice skates in Belgium. I did an article about that. They also got attacked for real multiple times, once because they were in Spain, a kid saw some of the locals had made like some kind of slingshots, and so he made one, and he shot it in the woods and actually hit a guy in the head, and the guy came out all angry with a bloody head, and got a mob against him. And so yeah, those are my sources. I will have this online where you can download the PowerPoint if you want to look at the stuff. All those paintings are really nice, high resolution. You couldn't see them on this because, you know, it's a fencing event. We're not super serious about this part of it, but those are available in super high resolution, so you can see all the different fighters, and it's actually pretty interesting. So that's it, guys. Any questions? Yeah, clap.
You mentioned someone being sold into slavery.
Yeah.
How prevalent, how allowed, how legal, gray area? Are there cultures that you know, if I found myself in possession of several people, how could I monetize them?
Yes, good question.
Who would I go to? What would I do?
It depends who you are and where you are. In theory, from about the 9th century, slavery of Christians was banned.
Okay.
However, they made exceptions for people that were from what they called schismatic Christianity, which was basically all the Orthodox Christians. And they also didn't count people they didn't really believe were Christians. So the Lithuanians were being attacked over and over and over by the Teutonic Knights. Teutonic Knights' unofficial model was they've been the slave of the devil, so why not make them slaves of Christ? And they would try to enslave them. But in places like that, and of course there was a huge industry of slavery by the Mongols, by the Mamluks, by the Ottomans. They would enslave anybody they could get a hold of all through the Mediterranean. The Barbary Corsairs were raiding all the way up to England. That's why the shores of Tripoli is in the U.S. Marine Corps him, because Thomas Jefferson had these sets of people after him. So that's a big industry. And the Spanish enslaved, and the Italians were brokering slaves for the Mongols in the Crimea.
So I would sell it to like a caravan of Mongols.
It depends who you are, but what actually happens is, in these situations, because you had 2 sides that were kidnapping people, you're probably going to have them for a while and then trade them back for some cousins or something, or somebody else that, you know, it's going to pay you to, you know, you trade these people back, that way I can get my uncle back. That's what happened between the Muslims and the Christians, and also between the pagans and the Christians up in the Baltic. And then with African slavery, they made a special exception. One of these bankers, I think it was Raymond Fruger, got a pope to make an exception, and they started enslaving Africans. And they said, well, even if they convert, they can still be made slaves. And that's where the whole horrible transatlantic trade thing started. And it started with the wine industry, like sugar and wine. But so yeah, it would be like more captivity. If you got captured by the Mongols, you could possibly approach the Genoese and see if they could find out, like if you survive the trip, which is hard, you could get bought back down in like Kaffa in Crimea or something like that. If you were enslaving people and they were Ukrainians or Russians or something like that, maybe you can, and you live in nearby somewhere, you could make them work on your farm for a while. But there would be rules where they could buy their way out.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be quite as harsh.
That was kind of my other question was, so when you say slavery, it's like captivity, forced serfdom, and then like...
Right, so not only was slavery outlawed, but serfdom was pretty much gone by 1400s, 1500s. and then it starts to be sort of reasserted. And that happens more after like the 30 Years' War in the 17th century. So Middle Ages are kind of a period where there is some freedom from that. And if you're captive, even like under Spanish law, slaves used to have to get some money and they would have a chance to buy their way out of it eventually. The English were the ones that introduced the really harsh laws for that. And a lot of it was tit for tat. You know, Cervantes was captured and enslaved by the Ottomans, and they had to ransom him back. So, you know, you don't want to be too harsh to your captives. Not that galley slave isn't harsh, but you want to give them some chance, because that way you may need to trade somebody back that's in, you know, that your neighbor or your family. Anybody else? Yeah.
So I was noticing something, and maybe it's just a couple images that were chosen, and so I'm drawing false correlation. But I was noticing that I think we saw like 3 guys in chainmail.
Yeah.
2 of them were conspicuously old.
Yes.
Is that something that is like noticeable in that, where it's like, hey, there's this generational gap. We have these guys who are like the elder baron, and they're coming in chainmail, and they're, you know, the young duke is coming in this harness.
I can't draw those conclusions necessarily, but mail could last a long time as long as it didn't rust away.
Yeah.
You know, they had ways of, you know, and it was valuable. Actually, mail, these armories like in Milan, which was like the big exporter for armor for a long time, they got the price down at a certain point. Then Augsburg really got it down, and it was the very, very good tempered steel armor became very inexpensive. So actually a mail shirt could cost more than like a Gothic harness. And there's mail and then there's mail too. Like there's a mail at the Met that they can't even get a pin through, and it's a super fine tempered mail that's for like that you are like a Medici and you're walking around in Florence and you're like, Giuseppe, I love you, and then oh, you son of a bitch, but you're protected, right? And George Silver says, you know, you meet an Italian, you think you might have trouble with him, you know, check him because he's probably got mail under his shirt, right? And that's a very super fine mail like that, something you could wear in a civilian context, and maybe they don't know. And if they don't know, the first cut might be, you know, where you're protected, which is good. That's why all those guys, a lot of them had clothes over their armor, and the painter made it clear that he had armor because the painter's trying to show you that. So yeah, this guy, he don't trust the Duke that much, you know. He came ready for trouble. Yeah. I don't know of anything like that in any fencing manuals. Maybe somebody else can say. They don't usually, the way the pedagogy of medieval fencing manuals certainly works is that they don't get into that. They basically break it up. That's why we were kind of confused in thinking that only harness or only bloss, and I'm pointing out I don't think that's the case, but they're not going to get into it because there's just too many permutations. However, you might find something like that in war books, Kriegsbücher, yeah?
I think the DEU specifies aiming for armpits and the inner groin, the spots that won't be armored.
Right, yeah, they do tell you, well, you know, there's a couple versions of the Durchwaffen, you know, where there's one where, that everybody does is where you parry and you come in and you grapple them. There's another version where you parry and you pass by them and cut the back of the thigh. If you're looking at German harness, Gothic harness, almost never protected on the back of the thigh because they're going for lightweight. They're going for tempered steel. So that's a vulnerable spot. You can do a coup de Jarnac on them. Anybody else? Yeah?
So, are these armor choices, how do I put it, like, is it more for, like, the change of warfare, mobility, combined arms, or is it more like the democratization of war in this period? In other words, there's more common men fighting or more middle class fighting, or is it the warfare's changed, or both? Or?
The reason I picked like 1480s to 1520 is because, and well, the last part was 1550s, but that's like the peak of armor.
Right.
That's when the most armor is being used everywhere. And the sort of the infantry revolution, or whatever you want to call it, that starts all the way back in the early 14th century. You know, that's like 1305, right? So it's hard to say. I would argue that successful armies were always combined arms. It's like, unless you're the French, and I can say this because I'm by blood largely French and also Irish. The French will go and say, we don't care about the infantry, we charge the cavalry, only the heavy cavalry may charge, everybody else fuck off, and then they get killed over and over and over. The British brag about it a lot, but the Ottomans got them like that twice. You know, they got owned in the Crusades like that. They got beaten by the Spanish like that. So, but everybody else is trying to do some degree of combined arms. They always have that. So all the successful armies have light and heavy infantry, light and heavy cavalry. You know, on the steppe, they had to learn to deal with the horse archers, and like those Russians knew how to do that type of fighting. But if you're in horse archers, you cannot just have heavy cavalry. You know what they do to heavy cavalry? A lasso. They lasso the guy and pull him off. There's actually some Ottoman manuals where you can see that. It's scary as hell. So yeah, you got tough armor. I'm just going to drag you for like 20 miles, and then we'll see if you've calmed down a little bit. So you got to have light cavalry with you, and that's why the lance, which, as you know, cavalry is broken up into lances, banners, etc. Lance is 5 riders. By 1400, every lance has a crossbowman, pretty much. And that was one of the antidotes against the light cavalry. They could kill the horse. But that's why those crossbows were so strong. They could kill a horse in one shot if you knew what you were doing. If you went to the Schützenfest over and over and over again. Nathan wanted me to mention Schützenfest. They're doing Schützenfest here. It's super cool. Texas gun culture meets crossbows and HEMA and really caring about the sources. I recommend that. Care about the sources. Go and read more about it. All this stuff is accessible. We did this like moonshot on fencing manuals. Do a moonshot on the context because you'll love it. You'll have a great time. You'll understand so much more about the world you live in. And you'll see it everywhere all the time. And it's not just something that somebody made up. It's not a comic book. It's not some fantasy genre. It's like the real world. And it's just as wild. It's crazy. So that's me. I'm Jean. Thanks a lot, everybody. And hope you enjoyed it. And yeah.